This conference will now be recorded.
Whenever you're ready.
Hi, this is Pat Wagner with Pattern Research in Denver, Colorado, and thank you for joining us. We're going to be talking today about curious about library supervision. Every program I do has a key idea, and the key idea today is that supervision requires a different point of view. The program today was designed for folks who have never been a supervisor, want to be a supervisor, and my favorite group of people, people who swear that they never, ever, ever, ever want to be a supervisor, because those are the folks that most likely fate is going to tap on the shoulder and make them a supervisor someday. The information we have applies to any kind of library, to special libraries, to academic libraries, public libraries, and also to school libraries, because we're also talking not just about supervising adults, but young people as well on this. So this is what it's for. You've never been a supervisor and you're curious about two things. One thing you're curious about is what's different about being a supervisor. And the second thing is, what does a supervisor do? So we're going to introduce a couple of models today as well. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of being a supervisor. I'm not going to pretend that it's perfect. There are challenges as well. As a trainer, I've run into lots of different, we'll call them workplace myths, things people have about what supervision is or isn't, and sometimes they're pleasantly surprised when they're promoted, and sometimes it's unpleasantly surprised, so we're going to cover that. Then we're going to talk about the models that we need to use as supervisors, kind of to introduce you to those so that it's something that you can actually practice and work on before that first promotion. One is the whole idea of setting expectations, the ideas of what are the goals that we want people to achieve, and what are the parameters or limits or curbs that they have to work within, so that we don't want to micromanage people. We want to have oversight and what that means. The second thing is the absolute best tool, positive reinforcement, and the fact that we have pretty good evidence from behavioral psychology that praising people appropriately, reinforcing what they're doing right, is actually the best way to get people to do what you want them to do. We're also going to talk about course correction. And this is a euphemism for when you have to sit down and tell somebody they're not doing something right and get them literally back on track for what they need to be doing. So it's called the assignment because it gives you a model that, again, works most of the time with most people to get them back on track. And then the issue of termination, which I think terrifies people more than anything, particularly if you're working with a smaller library where you've worked with people for a long time, you're promoted over them, and maybe you're not the person specifically who makes a decision if you're going to lay off someone or, quote, fire them, but you are certainly part of a team, and what you're recommending might make the difference. So we're going to talk about it, not just what you might do individually, but kind of your role in a team of people. And I believe very strongly that regardless of the behavior of the employee or the coworker, everyone gets to be treated ethically and fairly, often with compassion, even while at the same time we have to set a limit on their behavior. And then just some of the typical mistakes and a few resources that I think are useful as well. Again, for those of you who are watching this live, feel free if you have a comment, a question, or a concern. We'll keep an eye on them and we'll stop at intervals. And if you don't hear me respond immediately to a question, it's because I think it might be answered later on in the program that we're doing. Three outcomes that we hope happen today, that out of the program that you might have a better understanding of both the pros and cons, the rewards and challenges, that you spend more time developing those skills that you're going to need as a supervisor. I find a lot of times that when people enter the library field, they enter it because, they love children. They love reference. They enjoy cataloging and tech services. They like IT. Those are the things they focus on. Well, the whole issue of interpersonal relations and project management might not be something that you think of as something separate to develop. And we hope after today, this inspires you even more to develop those skills. And the fact that you can start applying those positive reinforcement techniques with library users, with coworkers, with bosses. Don't tell them. So you don't have to wait until you're promoted in order to be able to be good at that work that you're doing. So the first thing on the agenda is, from your lofty position as a new supervisor, what makes supervision both a rewarding thing and very difficult as well? So first of all, let's talk about personally rewarding. It's kind of like that old Bette Midler movie where she said, enough about me. What do you think about me? So for me, it really has to be about you, your career advancement, and what you care about. In Western society, if you want to make more money, you have to be able to go up the food chain as far as whatever kind of library it is. And as you get older and more experienced, there will be an expectation that you'll be willing to take on supervision. So even if you plan to be at your current position forever, life can intervene and suddenly you have to apply to other libraries, and they're going to look at your supervision skills in addition to everything else to decide whether or not they're going to hire you. Also, the higher up you get in the food chain, you will have more impact on the decisions and actions taken in the library. You'll have more influence. And for that, I think it's important. We sometimes run into someone, and I sometimes run into this person a little more in academic and special libraries than public and school libraries, but it's the smart person syndrome. Somebody is wicked smart at what they do for a living. They might be a subject matter expert reference librarian, for example. Really, really smart. And they have ideas about what should be happening differently in their library. So they talk about it, but after a few years, people aren't paying attention to them at the top, in the administration, because they're not showing the ambition and interest in understanding the bigger picture and stepping forward and taking the extra responsibility. So what happens is that even though they're smart and have good ideas, they might not feel that they have the influence that they should have, and they become bitter. I don't know if you've ever run into that person or not, but as I travel around the United States and Canada working with a variety of libraries, I run into that person. So it's almost like a cliche in a way. And I don't want any of you wicked smart people to fall into that trap. I believe, and this is a personal belief, that one of the reasons we're put on earth is to learn and grow. We have these great brains and we should use them. And that whole idea of learning new skills is really important because it's one of the ways that you're going to stay employable. The fact that you're willing to learn new things and take on things. Tiffany and I were just talking before the program started about how many things have changed in computers, for example, and we don't know what the world's going to come to in 10 years. I love to share the factoid that 1 year after the whole iPod and iTunes model were introduced to the United States, 1 year, there were 4 times as many regularly scheduled podcasts in the United States as there were licensed radio stations. And that was in 1 year. So I'm always interested in the fact that there's some kid in some garage in Kenosha, Wisconsin, right now working on a technology that is going to blow Apple away and dramatically change what we take for granted with libraries today. I like the fact that we get to see the world with fresh eyes, that we have a different perspective when we're working as a supervisor rather than someone who's a hands-on person. And it doesn't matter how intelligent the person is, how educated, what their credentials are, their tenure, how long they've worked at the position. Being promoted basically puts you higher up on the tree. You have a different scope and scale that you're looking at. And also, I think it is that other way of growing as a person. My mom, when I was growing up, used to tease me about the fact, as many parents do, just wait till you have kids of your own, because that's when you're really going to grow up. Well, my husband and I didn't have children, but you know what? I've had employees, I've been a coach, I've been a trainer, and the interactions I have with people are often a mirror for myself. I become a better person. I understand my flaws better interacting with other people. And so I always say that supervision has that component of you learn so much about yourself that you become a better person as well as the person that you're supervising. Uh, as far as when it happens to the workplace, people sometimes ask me, with all the different things that I teach, and work within libraries and universities, what are the things that I think make the biggest difference? And I think supervision. If there was one class and only one class I was allowed to teach to help libraries, this is the class I would teach. Why? First of all, it helps us elicit the best from people, and we become talent scouts. You know, you start thinking more about, what's this person good at? And the fun part, I'll tell you, is when they're good at something and they don't know it and you get to tell them. I was a college instructor for a number of years, and one of the best part of my work is when I'd be grading a term paper and I'd realize that the person was a really good writer. And I'd call the student in, and sometimes they were like, "Oh, what did I do wrong?" And I said, "No, you're a great writer. Did anyone tell you that you're a great writer and you have even greater potential?" And to be the first one to get to tell someone they're good at something, it's pretty awesome. To increase productivity and capacity, it's important because it's one of the very few things that we can do to make sure that a library can do more, because we're leveraging the capabilities of the people who work there, their competencies, their feeling of confidence of doing new things without actually spending more money. So you can actually improve how your library does its work by what you do. That whole thing about course correcting, of keeping people on track so we don't waste time and money because people are chasing, bright, shiny things, are being creative when they really need to be doing the job in front of them. That whole thing about managing conflicts, the hard decisions you have to make, that's a big deal. And I was part of a study done a few years ago that was published through ALA Editions about conflict resolution. And the co-authors, who were two academic librarians, sent out a questionnaire, hundreds, thousands of copies all over the United States and Canada, about conflict in management and resolution. And I was one of the people who helped go through these hundreds of responses that they got. And one of the things that became very clear to all of us, myself, the two authors, and a social worker who was brought in as well, is that the main cause of lasting kind of icky long-term conflict in institutions was conflict avoidance on the part of the supervisors and managers, not sort of digging in and doing the hard work to getting things done. To translate the strategic plan, I work on strategic planning for libraries and universities and so forth, and oftentimes they're kind of vague. I like concrete goals and so on. I want big, lofty things, but I want things that aren't so abstract. But the truth is, many people are working with a strategic plan that's kind of abstract. And if you're a frontline person, you're sort of saying, okay, what does it mean that we're going to be actualizing the creative potential of the creative potential? What do those words mean? And traditionally, it's the supervisors and managers who look at those big words that are often vague, abstract in the strategic plan, and say, what this means to us every day is this, this, and this. To communicate priorities, and when I have employees, and we are just a mom and pop business here, but for many years when we have special projects, I might hire a team of people for 3, 4, 5 years to do that particular project. And one of the things I tell them is part of my job is to communicate priorities and deal with log jams. And you'll hear me use that word again, log jams. And to make the hard decisions, which sometimes means cutting the knot in half, sometimes it means flipping a coin to get people back to work. So part of that is, do we know the priorities? So for example, in our little business, a really important priority is customer service. What that translates into, unless our office is burning down, if a customer calls, they get our first and full attention. And that was something I had to teach some of the people who came to work for me. And I remember a gentleman who did not work for me very long, who was an IT person, and we do a lot of webinars around the country, and his job was to fix the technology. That was part of his job description. So we got an emergency email in from a client out of state, and they were in the next hour about to do a staff day meeting using one of our webinars, and it wasn't working. So She copied me and copied the gentleman. I'll say his name was Bob. That wasn't his name. And I was watching as I was doing other things, and I didn't see Bob respond. So I went into Bob's office and said, "Hey, yo, did you get the stuff from those folks?" "Yeah." I said, "What do you mean, yeah?" He says, "Yeah, I haven't gotten around to it." I said, "They're going to be live in 45 minutes. I want you to contact them immediately." And he went, "Okay." So I went back to my desk. 5 minutes later, nothing had happened. I went back in and I said, "Now." He said, "I'm busy." And I said, "No, we have a priority here. I don't care what you're doing. You stop it now. And now you're going to pick up the phone and call them. You're not going to text them and figure out what goes on." Well, his attitude was that he got to set priorities. Well, within the framework of what he's doing, he can, but not when it comes to what are the priorities of our business regarding things like customer service. So that whole idea of priorities and goals and expectations is an important part of what you do. And then also that issue of maintaining consistency and identifying patterns. Maintaining consistency means that you spend that extra time um, making sure that everybody gets the same level of excellent service. And in identifying patterns, it's paying attention to the fact that, say, for example, that you're a supervisor at a circulation desk, and somebody comes up to you and say, "Oh, we're having a problem with the new interface on the computer, on the public computers. People reported to me a glitch." Well, you make a note of that. But then it happens again and again and again. And that gives you enough information that you can go to IT and say, "Here's the pattern that's going on," or a pattern of behavior among library users, or a pattern of requests for new services and so on. Those are the kinds of things we mean when we talk about patterns and contribution. But why don't you want to be a supervisor? And let's be honest, these are some of the reasons that people tell me they don't want to be, and I think they're valid. I think they're valid reasons. First and foremost, more paperwork. A lot of documentation, even when you're a frontline supervisor, that you need to take. And some of this, honestly, is legal issues of documentation to protect the rights of you, protect the rights of the library, protect the rights of the employees and the library users by taking notes that basically say, this is what happened and this is what's said and this is what was done. You can't spend 6 months on the job and then try to remember what happened 6 months before. For a lot of people, just not being clear about their role. I'm working right now with a large library in the East, and they just had a whole bunch of retirements, a whole bunch of promotions, and even people who've worked there for a considerable amount of time are confused about what they're supposed to be doing as a supervisor or manager. A lot of people tell me, "Well, you know what? They want to give me this promotion, but there's really no more money. And now I don't get to do the fun stuff." I got into library science because I love kids. I love story hour. I love reading readiness. I love advisory, work for kids who are like, wow, 8 years old, and they come and they ask me for a new book because they love the one I suggested. That's the heart of what I do. And now I'm sitting there making disciplinary notes, and I'm having to talk to disgruntled parents about that their kid didn't get enough time when we were doing this craft thing. And I have to go to meetings all the time with all the other department heads. That's not what I signed up for. So I want to do the fun stuff. For a lot of people too, it's simply that out of their comfort zone and the fact that they don't have the same control that they did when they were doing whatever the task was, because they're having to deal with annoying human beings on Earth. And we're not particularly an obedient species, particularly in the good US of A. So that lack of control and mastery is something. And the issue of mastery, I think, is sort of funny. Years ago, there was a computer program out there called List Label that was on a particular operating system. And there was a time, my husband and I think for 4 months, I was one of the leading authorities in 1978 on the use of List Label. Well, you know what? When you're a supervisor or a manager, you ain't going to be a master of anything. It's a constant process. It's like saying, oh, I have mastered parenthood. That's about as likely as you're going to be able to say when you're talking about that. So the ambiguity is something that is something a lot of people don't like. I would say the most common thing I hear, particularly in smaller libraries, is the fact that I don't want to be promoted above my friends because that's going to change our relationship. And I realize that I can't simply be a supervisor by being chummy, that things have to change. So we had a woman, this was an academic librarian in the upper Midwest, and she had been there for 25 years as, in effect, a supervisor and a director of an academic library. And she was great. She said, I have the greatest group of people to work with. I loved them. They were terrific. Loved everybody. We never had any problems, any conflicts. I did a great job. They thought I was great. I got the State Librarian of the Year award, you know. And then she decided to take a retirement job in a warmer climate than the northern Midwest, and a very competent person. And within 2 weeks, everybody hated her. And so I got called into work with her in the staff, and I started talking to her. And one of the things she said was, oh, I never had any problems at my previous job. For the 25 years, we all worked together just beautifully, just beautifully. And here's the problem, is that she never learned how to be a supervisor. She never learned how to have those difficult conversations. She never learned how to do conflict resolution. She never learned how to make friends with people, how to earn the trust and respect of people who hadn't known her for years. So when she walked in, she sort of assumed that, oh, everyone's going to love me the way they did at my old job, that I don't have to do any work. I don't have to build confidence in my decision making. And she started doing one of the big sins of a new director, of making a whole bunch of quick decisions to, quote, fix things, alienating everybody. And it never worked. It never worked, I have to say. So, but it's more the thing of, what if you know that when you get promoted, one of those buddies of yours is going to start slacking off because they know, well, it's my buddy Pat, and we've been friends for years, and oh, they're not going to say anything wrong. And I sadly saw this happen with a group of friends from high school, where there were several women I went to school with back in Wisconsin, and they all went to work for the local library. And one of them counted on the fact that her friends there, people she had known for years, would automatically give her the promotion she wanted and everything without her having ever to be a supervisor. Well, that didn't work out. And there was sort of a blow up, which she survived, but she said it was very humbling because she made assumptions about what her relationship with them was. Yes, those relationships may change. And then I'm going to make more mistakes in public. And this is the one that I think is hardest, that you are pretty sure, based on the culture of your library, that if you do have to make hard decisions, you won't be backed up by the administration. I think nothing is worse than being particularly a new supervisor or manager, stepping up and making a hard choice and then having it, in effect, undermined it by people above you in the food chain. Total morale killer. And I have seen this over and over and over again. So it may be that the library that you're working at now wouldn't be the ideal place to become a manager and work on your career, but you have to know there's plenty of places inside and outside South Carolina where you're going to find terrific libraries to work with. So I didn't know if you knew there was going to be homework. What I'd like you to do when the program is over is to sit down and make your own list of pros and cons. I mean, literally write them out by hand. I'm very old school about this. And what are the things you think are a good idea? What are the things that you think would need to change in order for you to accept a supervisory position? When you think of the cons, what would satisfy you or fix the situation? What would make a supervisory position more desirable? So that's your homework there. So if you have particular pros and cons having to do with supervision, please let us know. It's fun to read other people's ideas. So what are some of these myths of supervision that we're talking about that we get to hear from people from time to time? And again, this covers all kinds of library workplaces, not just public libraries, academic, school, and special libraries as well. Um, so one big myth is that if you're really good at your job, whatever your job is today, that's going to predict whether or not you're going to be good at supervision. And it's interesting, I don't see just individuals making this mistake, but I see people who are in charge of promoting folks. The thing I hear the most when a promotion goes bad and someone like me is brought in and we're trying to figure out to save the day, because it's expensive to train people for supervision and it's expensive to keep good people on, and we don't want to discard people. We want them to be happy and productive at their work, and when it doesn't work, everyone's concerned. And what I hear is, but they're so smart. Like, being smart automatically means that people are going to be good at the interpersonal skills needed. And that's simply not true. It's not automatic. My dad was a doctor, and he was head of a hospital in the Midwest. And he told me that his favorite kind of person to hire for a supervisory position was the oldest sister of a large family. He said, give me, and my dad was very old school. My dad would say, give me a gal who's the oldest of 8 kids. And I don't care if she's 18 years old and doesn't have any college, she's still going to be a terrific supervisor because she knows conflict management, and she knows what it means to get back to work, and she knows what it means to coax and cajole people into getting the job done. And she's calm and confident in a stressful time. So it's not just the fact that someone is older and has gone to school longer that means they're going to be a better supervisor. Along with that is that idea that suddenly you have power to make other people obey you. Like, what might get someone to want to be promoted is that, well, when I'm supervisor, we're going to fix everything. I don't understand why my supervisor just doesn't jump in and fix everybody instantly. Well, then you get promoted to supervisor and the world looks a little differently. And you realize that no, supervision isn't just ordering other people what to do. And I run into that a lot. It has to do with influence. It's not telling people what they shouldn't do. It's being able to pick your battles when you look at a human being that's complicated and decide, what are you going to work on, in what order? How does this behavior impact the other 6 people on the team? What are you planning to ask them to do 6 months from now? So all of those things are pretty important. And that idea that you'll automatically be able to fix things doesn't seem to work very well. Some people have what I call benign contempt for supervision. That anybody above them in the food chain doesn't really do real work. And I have to say, this was my attitude when I was in the printing industry, that I really didn't get what other people did. That wasn't the hands-on work. I didn't get what the supervisors or managers did. And so the thing is that, oh, we don't need supervisors. We're all self-starters. We're smart people. Supervisors have that bigger picture. They're the ones who are more likely to notice patterns and slippage and to keep people on track. And I find that even brilliant singletons can, what we call, drift a little bit. And then the whole thing of supervision can't be learned. And the truth is, it can. And I'm going to say that maybe 95% of people, regardless of their experience, are able to become supervisors and do a darn good job. There are a few people who are never able to cross the bridge over to being a supervisor, but you know what? It can be learned. It can be learned, which is good news. So here's some more homework for you. Remember, I told you more homework. That I think the absolute best way to learn the skills of being a supervisor and a manager is to be able to find mentors. And if you don't already have mentors in your life, inside and outside library land, to be able to interview 3 experienced supervisors. They may be relatives, friends, neighbors, people who work with your partner's or spouse's business, people who, if you work for an institution like a university might be a supervisor outside of the library. And what were the myths that they believed before they became supervisors, and how do they overcome them? What do they think is important about their work? And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as well. So that whole idea of looking for people who can give you a picture of what supervision is about, the pros and cons, again, I think is very important. So what about this idea of setting expectations, the goals and the parameters, and the idea that we're trying to keep people on track? And that's hard sometimes when you have people who, let's say, have developed their own eccentric way of doing things, people who have pet projects that are important to them, people who feel that because they have tenure, because they've worked at the library for 20 years, they get to do things exactly the way they want. But now we have a different way of doing it, that whole field of what we might call change management. So what does it mean to set a goal, and what does it mean to set a parameter? This is kind of the first skill set of being a good supervisor. And we're going to use words in a particular way. We're going to talk about something called an expectation, but an expectation is not the same as what the job description says. The expectation is, if you do your job well, what will be the outcome? As a quick example, if any of you have ever tried to lose weight, my hand is being raised right here, you might have a job description that says, I'm going to watch my portion control, I'm going to watch my calorie intake, I'm probably going to lower the number of refined carbs that I'm going to do. And so this is like the job description. The expectation is that I'm going to have more energy and I'm going to lose some weight. But you can do the job description and still not meet the expectation of the jobs. And that's what we're going to talk about next year. So this is a story I love, and I looked up, because I don't know that much about South Carolina hurricanes. The last time, according to what I read, that South Carolina experienced a Category 5 hurricane landing was 1900. And you can check me on that, but that's what I read. But let's talk about Hurricane Andrew, and that's the picture of Hurricane Andrew coming in, you know, the time shots of it hitting Florida. And when Hurricane Andrew hit Florida, the southern end of Florida, it was a hurricane. It was a Category 5 hurricane. And over 63,000, I'm not making the figure up, 63,000 buildings were leveled. But when they started doing the flyovers in the neighborhood, they noticed something, that some of the buildings were still standing. And they had a little fun with that. And so what we need to do when we do something like that is you have to go on the ground and start talking to people. And they found out something very interesting, that the buildings that tended to survive that Category 5 were buildings built by Habitat for Humanity. They were built to code. The building codes at the time weren't so bad, and the people who built to code were more likely to survive the hurricane. So when people talk to me about problems that they have with dealing with issues that come up, and we start going through the, well, did you set expectations? Did people know the goals? Did you set the parameters? Did you have these conversations beforehand? What we find out that people didn't. They got kind of relaxed, laissez-faire about doing the documentation and communicating what needed to be done. So the things I'm talking about right now are things having to do with building to code. Now, someone just asked a really good question, and I want to do a sidebar now. And the question was, what if the administration's expectations don't match those of the staff? Well, I'm all for negotiation. I'm all for, this is what we're going to do. But the administration has to take in information from a number of places. They have to take in information from the staff, but they also have to take in information from the library user, regardless of the kind of library it is. They have to take in information from the funders, meaning if it's a tax-supported institution or an institution that survives off of grants, what the expectations are of the stakeholders. So the staff isn't the only part of the contract, as it were. And at the end of the day, The workplace is not therapy, it's not welfare, it's not a social club, and it's not your family. You have a contract with expectations. And I think the hardest time is when there's what we call a strategic shift. And I'll give you one quick example, and that's when in Denver Public Library, when there was a major strategic shift as to what the reference staff at the Denver Public Library would be doing, that we would no longer be subject matter specialists like in an academic library. And they pushed the reference librarians, this was decades ago, into the branches to serve the everyday people. Well, people felt betrayed and horrified. Some people quit, some people complained. But at the end of the day, the library was not there to suit the needs of the staff. It was there to suit the needs of the community it served. So there was negotiation and everything, but every case that I deal with like this is different. The administration has to be better at communicating. The staff has to be better at communicating. So yes, when we're going through big shifts, they're going to be unhappy people, and that becomes very interesting as we go on. Without more details, it's hard for me to tell. And I don't think of bad guys and good guys. You can have really, really good people, both of them are right, who disagree about expectations as well. So what we think about in a goal, as I said before, is what will your team accomplish if they're successful, which is not just going through the daily tasks. It has to do with an idea of the difference between outputs and outcomes. Understanding this will make you that much better as supervisor. So, for example, we had this great teen book club. And the output, which we were all proud of, was that we had good attendance. But what we were trying to achieve was to see if we could actually get the grades up, for kids to get better grades on their tests, on their the things that they turned in, term papers and so on. So we might have good attendance, but if grades didn't go up, then it isn't the success we think. We had this big shelving project going on, and we were great at shelving, lots of books. I made 4,000 books a day. That's per person, right? But the outcome we want to increase circulation because we're able to get those books on the shelves, and because people are able to use the circulation and like the library better, they vote for us when it comes to a bond referendum. Well, we wanted to develop a project in adult literacy, and we were so proud at how many people showed up for the program. But what we were looking for was people to get better jobs because they had better reading and writing skills. And yes, we want the library to be clean, but if it's clean, the outcome is that it feels safe and it's welcoming to people. So understanding that it's not just the daily tasks we're doing, but the outcome is that bigger picture that supervisors have. And I tell people that if you happen to work for an institution that doesn't have a concrete strategic plan or doesn't have a working strategic plan, something that people can use and translate into something that means something to them, I tell people a great default is the better lives of the people you serve, and that's the goal. The goal is not to have a better library. The goal is for the people you serve and the institutions and communities you serve to be better on their terms, that people are able to achieve their personal goals. So this is something a supervisor does every day, reminds the people that it's about the people that we serve inside and outside the library. Then we have this idea of parameters, that we're working within certain goals, and the literature calls them all sorts of things: limits, curbs, constraints, restraints, laws and bylaws, checkpoints and timelines. And what they translate into is something like, are we doing the job we were hired to do within the constraints of budget? How much staff time it's taking to do certain things? Are we setting production goals and having deadlines? And during this whole thing that we're doing, are we treating each other well? Civility and manners. I don't care if you're the best at what you do. If you can't say good morning and please and thank you when you come to work for everybody all the time, you don't get to work for me. We have a famous story in our household about a man who came to hire my husband for a big job. My husband's an economist who works on helping high-tech businesses with their startups. And this man had heard about us and heard about my husband, wanted to hire him. And my husband's, of course, wonderful and marvelous. And they went out to lunch. And we're here in Denver, Colorado. So my husband said, hey, there's a great Tex-Mex restaurant down the block. And my husband's from Texas. And so they went to the restaurant and they came back. And my husband had that grim face on. And my wife radar was going. I knew there was something wrong. And my husband said, sorry, I'm not going to work for you. And the man was like, what do you mean you're not going to work for me? And my husband said, you were rude to the waiter. And character counts in our little business. And I'm afraid that if you're the kind of man who's going to be rude to a waiter, then we don't want to do business with you. Now, I wish I could be queen and magically allow you to let people who work for your library who aren't civil go find another place to work where they don't have to be civil. But I don't have that magic wand. But what I can say is that you can, even before you become a supervisor, raise the standard. I've worked in your state and I know the people are wonderful, but I also know sometimes there's people who have been at a place too long who think they've earned the right to be grumpy. Well, not on my watch. So that thing again is that what we're trying to do with the expectation model is to achieve the goals, the outcomes within the parameters. We're going to get those outcomes that are part of the strategic plan and still, pay attention to things like budgets and stuff. But fortunately, being a supervisor, that's why you're paid the big bucks, right? I'm sorry, that's funny. So here's some more homework for you. How would you score your team or your department, your branch, your special project group, your committee, your library, on how well they know the expectations of the job? If I went to visit and asked people, what are the goals? What are you trying to achieve here? Would they be able to tell you? Would they be able to explain what the parameters they have to work within? This is something that I think is formally and informally important for productivity in any workplace, and it's part of the job of a supervisor. Now, the best tool you're going to have as a supervisor, actually as a human being, is positive reinforcement. When I was growing up, there was a lady who was very grateful for something that my dad had done years ago. And every Christmas, we waited for the box of homemade cookies that she made. And she would make 20 or 30 or 40 kinds of cookies, and they were all just like amazing. I've never had cookies that good again in my life. So don't you think we thought kindly of that lady? So what is positive reinforcement? Positive reinforcement is not just what you might call grade inflation. It's not just being perky and happy and nice to people all the time. It's about paying attention to when people are doing things right, pointing out what they're doing and rewarding it with positive attention. And it's about being very sincere and specific and concrete with what they're doing, and to do it also in a timely fashion, not 3 years later. But the ideal is that you're walking again by a service desk, see somebody do something great, and you can come back in 10 minutes and say, hey, Pat, I saw you working with that very difficult lady, Tiffany, who comes to the circ desk, and you were so nice to her and pleasant, even though I know she can be difficult. Thank you. That helps us out so much. That's exactly the kind of welcoming thing, we know it's hard, that we want, and I appreciate it. Showing people that you appreciate them is part of the reward that they're going to get. Now, I don't think it should be canned. Everyone who works for you has a different style. How you might interact with the 18-year-old student might be different between that and how you work with someone who's been there for 50 years. So we want to pay attention to something that means something to them as well. Now, this is really important if you are an academic or a school librarian or someone who works with young people. A 5-to-1 ratio is the very least that we should expect, meaning that that for every criticism you have of a person, you should have had 5 legitimate reasons to praise them for doing something right. Thinking
Mhm.
over a week's period of time, okay? 5 to 1. But with young people, some studies say that the ratio should be 10 to 1 because young people simply don't have the experience to weigh what criticism is about. And I grew up in a family of first and second generation immigrants on the south side of Chicago, and they didn't believe in praising children. So I grew up, and for a long time, I thought that was the way that you did things. You didn't have to praise people. But you know what? For young people, it can be debilitating. And again, I'm not talking about false grade inflation. I'm talking about pay attention to what people are doing right and making sure you're doing it to everyone, not just your favorites. And if you tell me that someone isn't doing something right and that they, quote, never do something right, my response is, you know what? You're not paying attention. That constant rain of you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, I'm fixing you, I only interact with you to tell you something wrong, is something interesting in behavioral science because the behavioral scientists say what you're accidentally doing is reinforcing what they did wrong by paying attention, but you're not telling them what they did right. And it can lead to apathy and cynicism and despair. And when I enter a workplace and they say one of the problems we're having is low morale, that's one of the first things I look for is how do the supervisors and managers interact with the employees? And how much time do they spend telling people they're wrong or as bad, never interacting with them at all? We call it abandonment. And I use that phrase because that's what employees tell me. We feel abandoned by the people higher up than us in the food chain as well. So here's some more homework. First of all, how often do you compliment and thank the people you work with? And are those genuinely specific and sincere and concise in a timely fashion, that they're realistic? Do you show your gratitude to some people more than others? Of course, there are going to be people you work with who are more likable, but that's not what should tell you as a supervisor who you should be paying attention to. That whole thing of how do you treat people fairly is so important. And when you talk about people, oops, we're getting a little music there. I'm going to wait for someone to mute that person if we can. Let's see. Thank you very much. So, what is the ratio between you complaining and asking for things versus complimenting and thanking people? And by the way, this is a mistake that we make with people above us in the food chain. That the only time we talk to our supervisors and bosses and so on is when we want to complain about something or we want to ask them for something. So a good way you can practice positive reinforcement is also right now paying attention to people above you in the food chain about when they're doing something right that you can sincerely compliment them on in a sincere and specific way as well. It works. It works, folks. So course correction, and this I think is one of the more important things that also go along with the idea of termination, but we'll start with the assignment. Somebody is doing something wrong. And I learned this phrase from one of my mentors who's a behavioral psychologist: beware warm chats. How many of you have ever been involved in endless conversations to change behavior and nothing changes? Has anyone ever had that? Well, that's what a warm chat is. Again, endless conversations with no behavior change. It's also called nagging, and nagging does not work in our species very well. People just turn it off. So what does it mean to give people an assignment? Here is a brief model of this, and I'm going to mention a reference at the end of the program that deals with this a little more. First of all, you always have to listen to their side of the story, because guess what? You might be wrong. You may have the wrong information. You may even have the wrong person. I've seen this happen before. You want to establish what it is that you want them to achieve instead, not to focus on what they did wrong in the past, but what you want them to do differently in the future. You also have to talk about what it is that you'll do to determine success. Will it be just on what you see and hear? Will it be something like, I don't want to hear any more complaints from library users about you lecturing them on whatever? How will you determine success? Will it be a number that it's reasonable for us to ask you to um, basically check in X number of books or to work on X number of books in a particular period of time, and your teammates are able to do it, so we think this is a good expectation. And whatever you do, there's a check-in period that usually is a week saying, okay, today's Friday, this is my expectation of what we're going to do differently, and I'm going to ask you to come in 3 o'clock next Friday and we'll see how things are going. So we talk about what we want them to do differently. How they do it is up to them. How they do it mostly is up to them. It's about, again, goals and parameters. And this might be a good time to review parameters if that's the problem that they're going off track. Now, if they're successful, praise them and set up the next check-in. Depending on the author and the situation, people say it can take 3 to 6 months to get that change in as a habit, but we never can take our attention away from it, even if it's just the 5-second check-in once a week, because that's when we get drift. That's when people say, well, Pat's not paying attention anymore, and neither do I. And that's one of the big mistakes people make. Now, if the result is not achieved, then you're going to have to decide what action to take. Do you give them 1 chance, 2 chances, 10 chances? What do the legal authorities attached to your institution say? Which is why we have to also talk about the issue of termination and how do we discipline people as well. So we're going to practice a minute with this idea of, can you translate workplace issues into something that is concrete and specific? What is the new behavior that we mean? And a lot of times we're comfortable sort of saying, I kind of know why I'm upset with person, but it isn't as easy as that they're not showing up on work on time. So what I've done with this slide is create some examples of what does respect mean. You have that person who you're uncomfortable with, and you want to say, you're not being respectful enough to me and to other people here at work. Respect is kind of a vague word, but what if you say, please address people by their name? Please invite people to a budget meeting if it affects their workplace. Please let other people finish their sentences. You constantly interrupt, Pat. I want to be able to see ideas implemented with input from other people or know the reason why not. Please give me your full attention and other people full attention when they're talking to you. Include me in decisions that affect my job. These are all definitions or descriptions of the word respect given to me by people who've taken my classes. What does that word mean? So you might have to practice to be able to deal with this. Question said about documentation of these meetings. Yes. And what you always do is go up the food chain to the people in legal and HR and find out what they require in terms of documentation, because in the worst case, you are creating a legal document that might have to be entered into a courtroom. And I'm not for big bureaucracy or anything like that, but I've seen so many cases where the supervisor didn't do what they needed to do, and then we were not able to deal with that problem employee that really needed to be terminated. Good question. So then there's the things when supervision is not enough. So the first thing I want you to do is to be able to know the rules and laws. And as I just said, we need to know about confidentiality. We need to know about what are the requirements legally from state personnel offices, the institutions that we work with. And the person who will tell you the best information is the legal entity, the lawyer and or HR that would represent the library in court if there was a lawsuit. So don't ask your buddies online. Drives me crazy when I see people asking legal questions on Facebook. Go ask the lawyer who's going to stand up there in court and talk about it. That at every step of the way, the person was treated with respect, no bad mouthing, behind their back, that it was a specific issue, not just that you didn't like them, that that team is in place with HR and legal, that you practiced what you had to tell them, and you were prepared for pushback. So you said, okay, what if they sue? What if there's this kind of problem or that kind of problem? So you're prepared. And I see that libraries that do this kind of preparation are able to fairly terminate people, even in a union situation, because they are fair and they know the law. You want to know the law better than anybody else. That's your homework. So that is actually your first homework, to find out what are the rules and laws that governs how your library files people. Not what people tell you. Take a look at the actual documents in place, and you get extra credit if you found any surprises. So what are some of the typical mistakes people make? This is kind of a review of what we've talked about the last couple of minutes. Before becoming a supervisor, you think you're going to have control and not need any influence, like the lady I mentioned who had been a star for 25 years before she moved to the new academic library. Or the fact that because you've been such a good employee for 15 years, that means automatically you're going to be a great supervisor. Once you become a supervisor, please don't despair. It's not that you know nothing, you know everything. It's a chance to improve both your interpersonal skills and your project management skills. And for some people, they realize that becoming more comfortable, being able to juggle more things and balance more things is just as good as mastery, right? It's not about right and wrong. It's not about good and bad. It's about better or worse. And that may be the triumph at the end of the day. So here's some books that I think should be in everybody's professional studies thing. I'm looking to see if we have any other questions in, and I'm going to turn things back over to Tiffany, and we can see if there's any questions or comments that people have brought in. And if not, I can tell you a couple of the books on the list that I think are the most important on the list. For sure, I would say that the book, Dick Groat's book, Discipline Without Punishment, from the American Management Association. It's been in print for many, many years, and it outlines how to have those difficult conversations and deal with assignments and termination in a way that's respectful. Karen Pryor's book, Don't Shoot the Dog, is the Bible, the dog is the Bible for positive reinforcement. Best for new supervisors, managers. Any of these books are good for people who've been doing it for 5 minutes or people who've been doing it for 25 years. I get a lot of feedback from experienced supervisors and managers that they like these books as well, for how that they kind of refresh their skill set as well. So those are the two absolute musts on this list as well.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I was going to say, Tiffany, did you get any questions that I didn't pick up?
Nope. No, I'm not seeing any other questions. I didn't get any separately. Kind of a quiet group. And I don't see anybody typing or responding. So, all right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.